This is Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver on March 12, 2007, the earliest recorded dev build in the timeline, and around 29 months before the games would release. These games are often described as the greatest Pokémon games ever made, and a perfect standard for what a Pokémon remake should be. So when MD Travis came through with every single development build of HeartGold and SoulSilver, I felt as though these games deserved a timeline, much like what I did with the Generation 5 games. I will essentially walk you through every single development milestone in this video, from the very start all the way up to release, and show you how the game evolved over time, as well as pitch in my analysis. Definitely go subscribe to MD Travis, by the way. This video would not be possible without him building each prototype from code. Also a shout out to the cutting room floor. A lot of very specific dates on when certain things were added were noted over there. Highly recommend checking out their pages after watching this video. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to take you through the whole development timeline of Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver. So please enjoy, after a short word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Zen Market. Being a nerd can be expensive these days. Between scalpers, rising prices on retro games, and outrageous overseas shipping costs, collecting what you love can get brutal fast. There's also just so much retro gaming, Pokemon merch, and general anime merch that you can only buy if you have a Japanese address. That's where Zen Market comes in. Zen Market is an online proxy service that gives you access to over 10,000 Japanese online stores. And using it is super easy. Just copy and paste a Japan-only product URL into their search bar and you're good to go. After you purchase, Zen Market ships the items to their warehouse, which then they can directly ship it straight to your door. If you want to learn more, check out the link below. And make sure to sign up with the code TURTLEBRO to receive 1000 Zen points, which is the equivalent of 1000 yen off your shipping fee. To maximize Zen Market's value, I'd personally recommend taking advantage of our free 60-day warehouse storage, buy items from multiple stores, and then ship everything in one parcel to save big on shipping costs. Thanks again to Zen Market for sponsoring this video, and remember to use my code. Now back to the video. So to paint the picture, March 12, 2007 is the first build in the recorded timeline. According to MD Travis, the current evidence strongly suggests that development actually began much earlier, specifically around late 2006. And the reasoning is pretty convincing. You see, by March 12, the project already shows noticeable progress. When typically a remake project would begin by branching off a clean completed copy of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. And as you can see, there's already a prototype Lugia title screen with a logo that pops up labeled simply Pokémon Silver. Compared to the final version, this Lugia model is shockingly complex for early DS era Pokémon. The articulation and posing go beyond what most DS games, especially Pokémon titles, were using for their 3D models. And the music is also a completely original prototype track. Once you enter the game, it's immediately clear this build is running directly on a Diamond and Pearl base. After the intro, you're dropped into the player's room, however you are unable to leave. Entering the debug playstate, you're dropped into an empty Sinnoh map. No NPCs, no interiors, no wild Pokemon. And as you can see, you already have a following Chikorita. The background music is also Violet City from Firered and Leafgreen, also known as Island 6 and 7, but played using the Diamond and Pearl sound bank. In your party, you also have Wailord, Ho-Oh, and Piplup. Besides Piplup, every one of these was newly implemented as a following Pokemon. Logically, I'd assume they chose Wailord as a way to benchmark the sizes of the following sprites, since it is the largest Pokemon. Fast forward a month, and Ethan is now standing in Jubilife City. For those that don't know, his early HeartGold sprite was originally a direct recreation of his Game Boy design. Of course, you'll see this change later in the video. It feels very strange seeing this. There's also very random numbers assigned to your ball counts. At least you were able to use the bike, though Ethan would transform into Lucas. If you've ever wondered if you can ride your bike on water, no you can't. 2 days later, Ethan was dropped into a strange checkerboard test map. Walking around the checkerboard map, you'll find that it's divided into square zones. bordered by impassable objects. The way these borders extend and wrap at corners suggests these weren't random walls, but likely regional boundary placeholders. Based on how Game Freak built their areas, this was likely a complete border outline for the Johto region. The third milestone came at the end of the month, with a pretty big update, as it marks the first appearance of any kind of actual Johto map, Ecruteak City and Route 37, surrounded by that same checkerboard terrain. Ecruteak even has its own groovy prototype track. Ecruteak technically first appeared in an April 18 build, but that version was just a rough layout with no textures. One cool detail is that originally the bell tower area was directly baked into the main map, just like in the Game Boy versions. That design was quickly scrapped, and by April 27, it had already been separated into its own map. NPCs are now present and fully interactable, using dialogue pulled directly from the original games. Around the burn tower, the layout still mirrors the Game Boy version too, without the staircase redesign in the final game. Combined with Ethan's early sprite, it's like looking into an alternate timeline. Emily Travis made an amazing GIF showing just how much this one area changed within a single month. There's so much insight here alone, showing how many micro revisions Pokemon towns would go through early in development. The Pokédex had now been updated, now actually featuring the entire national dex from Kanto up to Hoenn. And yes, you now own a Groudon. Since both Totodile and Groudon were added to your party, you could also interact with your following Pokemon, though the responses were extremely basic. Groudon, like Waylord earlier, was likely used as a scale benchmark sprite, testing how tall Pokemon could be. Our next milestone comes from the end of June, around 2 months later. First off, the Ecruteak music had been upgraded with proper instrumentation. More of Johto was now modelled, complete with NPC placement and dialogue. Many of these areas still lack final textures, however New Bark Town was fully textured. There's even a placeholder version of Silver next to the lab, and a flag preventing you from leaving New Bark Town until you collect a starter. The eastern exit is also bordered by a checkerboard map. I noticed that the interiors kind of felt like they were Game Boy scaled. The player's house especially made me feel this way. Even the lab kind of resembles the Game Boy structure by laying out the starter Pokemon. The Pokemon Center included Nurse Joy, and the healing actually works, though Ethan briefly transforms into Lucas during the animation. While New Bark Town looked visually complete already, Ecruteak had seen further revisions too. The bell tower area was now in the game as well, and it's the small details here, like the trees and the ground texture, that I just appreciate so much more now. There's such a big story to Diamond and Pearl's development that I want to share with you someday, but to keep it brief here, they were incredibly rushed and unfinished, especially visually, so this was a huge step up in art direction. Like these trees were completely unique assets designed for use in this small area alone. And remember, they still had plenty of development time left, which starts to make you realize why these games ended up looking so polished. The bottom screen UI is also completely original here. Instead of showing the Pokétch like Diamond and Pearl, it now had a custom interface featuring start menu tools. That must have been a revolutionary breakthrough in Game Freak's office. Then on July 9, Wild Encounters were finally implemented. This strangely wasn't labeled as an official milestone, but I think it's certainly a milestone for a Pokemon game. At this stage, you could only encounter Pidgey, Pidgeotto, Ladybug, and Stantler. South of Ecruteak, you can literally see the transition between HeartGold tiles and leftover Diamond and Pearl tiles. They were essentially using Sinnoh's tileset as rough placeholder terrain for Johto's environment. Here's actually a perfect example of what I'm saying. Just west of New Bark Town, you'll find this area that perfectly splits the Diamond and Pearl tileset from the HeartGold tiles. It's like walking into a complete different art style. It's honestly one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And here's a little run through of August 9. The earliest prototype track for New Bark Town was now in the game. Towards the east, you could spot another Diamond and Pearl tileset split. The HeartGold water tiles look so good in comparison already. You might not have felt like HeartGold and SoulSilver was this massive artistic leap at the time. I know I didn't as a kid, but it really was. Silver finally had a sprite too. though still using his original gold and silver design. This wouldn't change until very late in development. Route 29 was complete. It even had the NPC near the sign just like in the original game, though he was removed in the final version. Wild encounters had expanded throughout more of Johto, though catching Kakuna crashed and gave me a not Sinnoh Pokemon error. Cherry Grove City looked visually complete. Interestingly, the northern pond was still inaccessible like the original Game Boy version. In the final game, this pond became accessible and was actually known for having a split route with different encounters. Despite much of the early overworld looking complete, Violet City still looked like this. Very strangely, a mid-action sprite of Dawn was used as an NPC placeholder. At this point, the entire base Johto map was modeled in. Many locations already had NPCs with full dialogue. All gym leaders were present in the world too, though represented using Sinnoh gym leader sprites. That said, only Ekritique Gym had a working battle. While the trainer sprite was still from Diamond and Pearl, the team was very much Morty's team from a final game. And yes, a random Regigigas was just standing there talking like a regular bloke. You could now use Fly, which let you see the brand new Johto map UI. And fun fact, see that little map icon sprite of Ethan? TCRF actually noted that a Chris map icon was created shortly before this. Yup, Chris from Pokemon Crystal and not Lyra from HeartGold. It even went through multiple revisions before being removed and replaced with Lyra in 2008. Makes you wonder if they originally planned to include Chris in the game. The Pokemon Center finally received the updated HeartGold design along with implemented music, though healing your Pokemon still turned you into Lucas. You can also see Silver's front-facing sprite here, notably still using the Game Boy design. But what truly makes this build a milestone was the fact that the early game was now completely playable. You start with Professor Oak's intro, using a stretched firered sprite by the way, Marill appears, and then you're dropped into Johto. From there you can play through the early game and pick your starter, buy Pokeballs, battle Pokemon, and progress through the early routes. MD Travis did a playthrough of this build and noted that the game became less complete the further you progressed. But you could still visit and collect all 8 gym badges. And speaking to the NPC at the league with all 8 badges would roll the credits. So by August 9, 2007, the game was technically playable start to finish. I kind of like how early and rough this was. It's like art. You do the rough outline sketch of what you want and then fill in with all the detail and polish that build towards a complete piece. Fast forward just over 2 months and we reach October, the month of Route 47. For those that don't know, Route 47 and the Johto Safari Zone were brand new areas introduced in HeartGold and SoulSilver. They sit just west of Cianwood City, and together with Route 48, form a long trek that leads to the entirely new Johto Safari Zone. And these areas trace back to October 2008. It first appeared in game on the 7th, just out of nowhere. Honestly, seeing terrain like this at this stage of DS Pokemon is kind of wild. The cliffs kind of remind me of the open world concept from Gen 5, which is a date we will reach later in this video. But yeah, despite some noticeable differences, the general path towards the Safari Zone was laid out. The area didn't even get the official Route 47 label until the 23rd. Then we get to milestone 6. Right away I noticed that the gym exteriors now featured wing-like designs around the gym logos. These were themed around each gym's type, and it is a cut design feature in the final game. A small touch, though I thought it was pretty cool. More of a Johto region had received their NPCs, including Goldenrod, though the infamous mid-animation Dawn sprite made a return here as a placeholder too. Overall, the game now felt like an actual experience than just a prototype thrown together. The water in Cherry Grove City just looked fantastic at this point. Compared to Diamond and Pearl, the difference is night and day. Again, these are details that I just didn't appreciate as a kid. And continuing off the art analogy, even the Mr. Pokemon and Professor Oak cutscene was implemented, meaning they were already pushing on adding story events even with these unfinished interiors. I also mentioned that Chris's map icon had existed in development. However, if you chose the female protagonist at the start of the game, it just default to the Dawn sprite. I really wish I knew the backstory behind Chris and Lyra. Also, I had just realized that bringing up your menu would now actually direct focus to the bottom screen, removing the top screen menu completely. Trainer battles had expanded massively by this milestone. Trainers across Johto now had real Johto teams implemented, and battles were scattered all over the region. The party menu had finally updated and now looked very close to its final design. Meanwhile, the bag menu still resembled the Diamond and Pearl version, but with the top screen and bottom screens flipped, which actually mirrors how the final game displays its bag information. Our next update comes from November 14. One of the first things that stands out here is the gold coloured text box. Very nice touch. Azalea Town was now in with proper textures, along with a prototype version of its music. You could also now catch non-Sinnoh Pokemon. By now I'd say pretty much all of Johto's base NPCs had been added, pretty much one-to-one to the original game, with complete dialogue too. Up north, the Lake of Rage event was already being staged as well. The red Gyarados was technically there, though represented by a Machop sprite. There's a lot of silver on this route too. Shortly after Christmas, Game Freak marked 2 milestones back to back. On the 26th, the Burn Tower got an interior. Looks pretty nice in here. It's home to some guy that's apparently looking for the legendary Pokemon. The Aquatique Gym randomly added a table to the interior. Back in Newbark Town, a cutscene would now play with Jigglypuff and placeholder Lyra, similar to one of the first cutscenes in the final game. Lyra's house at this stage was also labelled as Support's House. Violet City finally received its proper textures too, though the Pokemon Center had some strange colouring at this point. Sprout Tower also got its complete interior, this being one of the very first truly original interiors made for the game. And here's the Slowpoke Well at the time. Hard to tell if the dialogue here is true to the location or pulled from elsewhere. And the first Berry Tree assets appear in the game around this time, though they were just signposts. The milestone from the next day wasn't anything particularly special, though it marked the end of 2007 development. Heading into the new year, we see a couple big changes before the first milestone. On the 9th, Ethan's sprite was now updated to the all-new HeartGold design, and Lyra made her long-awaited first appearance, only in the character select screen. She still wasn't playable yet, however that would change in just 2 days, because on the 11th, Lyra's Overworld Sprite was fully implemented. The first milestone of the year would come at the end of the month. As you can see, they had actually made some adjustments to the intro screen, and you no longer had to press the little Pokeball to progress. The bottom screen UI was overhauled again, and honestly I think it's such a great upgrade. It's just way more aesthetically pleasing. The Pokegear UI was also updated, though it really only let you customize the interface. The player's house and Professor Elm's lab were now fully modeled and looking close to final. It seems they still hadn't quite figured out how to display the Pokeball in the lab. Even the tour guide event in Cherry Grove City was implemented. You know how in the final game, you can toggle a run button on the bottom screen? Well, originally you had to hold the button down. I can kind of see the vision. It was probably more like a virtual B button if you wanted to use your stylus instead for whatever reason. No wonder they shifted the quick access UI towards the right. It was at this point that I realized you still had the Sinnoh Underground gear in your bag, though using it would crash your game. Then we get to February 29. We now have town nameplates, the starter Pokemon contraption, and even the 3D starter select screen. Ethan also finally had his battle sprites. They also opened up the Cherry Grove Pond. Ilex Forest was now in the game. On top of that, Sprout Tower and Dark Cave became the first complete interiors, the first of many dungeons in the game. And the Pokeathlon minigame began production. It was clearly very much a work in progress. I'll put a comparison up to the final game on screen right now. It's so interesting to see such a rough prototype version of it. By the end of March, many of the gyms were now structurally complete, filled with NPCs, those still using placeholder designs. Ilex Forest looked properly finished too, with a noticeable step up in detail. The national park map was finally added, and interestingly the fountain area still had that rigid blocky shape from the original. It hadn't yet been smoothed out into the oval shape yet. The Pokeathlon also received a couple new minigames at this time. I'm not deeply familiar with the final Pokeathlon and which prototypes evolved into what, but it's clear that the side content was now being fleshed out in parallel with the main Johto progression. And finally, the Slowpoke Well was in the game. Fun fact, the original Gold and Silver didn't have this little entrance area. However, Space World 97 did. There's actually quite a lot of similarities between Space World and HeartGold that I'm planning to cover in a future video. Then, in late May, something very strange happens. The title screen music suddenly became a broken piano track. This is because music was shifted over to the new instrument set. Since DS games used sequenced music rather than streamed, developers could pretty much swap out the instrument set to change how tracks sounded, causing issues like this. A lot of sound effects were unintentionally affected as well. This also happened to be the same day that Lyra's map icon was added to the game. RIP Chris. Shortly before this, the Team Rocket outfits for Ethan and Lyra had also been added. At this stage there were simple placeholder color swaps, and wouldn't receive their proper designs until March 2009. I also want to highlight the dungeon cut-in artwork from around this time. There's a great example from a day later, when the cut-in art for Viridian Forest was added in, which looked very different from the final version. In fact, most dungeon artworks went through both significant and micro revisions throughout development. Speaking of Viridian Forest, that was indeed an indicator that work on Kanto had finally begun. Regarding the overworld at least, for whatever reason, Celadon City of all places was now just a copy of Ecruteak City. This was very random. Keep in mind, the rest of Kanto was still a checkerboard placeholder. The crazier part is that the Celadon Ecruteak actually resembled the final Ecruteak more than the real Ecruteak did at the time. Heading into milestone 16, Ecruteak's track sounded rather broken, a sign that they still hadn't fixed all the music since the soundbank change. Interestingly, this is what the ledge jump sounded like. Several early to mid-game events were now implemented, including this encounter at the Ecruteak Pokémon Center. But most importantly, Goldenrod City was now in the game, and nearly everything was present. The bike shop, the flower shop, the department store, the underground tunnel, even the global terminal was there, though it featured a completely different exterior compared to the final. So that's very unique. And the final version was just identical to the Jubilife building. In general, it seems the events of the game had reached all the way up to Goldenrod City. Cherry Grove City also had a very unique music track. It's like a mix of a modern track and a Game Boy inspired remix of the modern track. Give it a listen. It just goes to show how much passion they had to want to go above and beyond for the game's soundtrack. And yes, whirlpools were now in. Fun fact, you can actually walk on the whirlpool tiles. Then we get to late July, a very important point in the timeline, because this is when the Platinum merge happened. This is also when Platinum, HeartGold, SoulSilver, and Black and White were all deep into development at the same time. Truly a legendary period in Game Freak's history. These were truly back-to-back hits at the very peak of 2D Pokémon. Some of you might remember that I previously talked about a Black and White open world test, which came from around this time. MD Travis made this amazing GIF too that depicts the development of the games each month in simultaneous real time. The Platinum games were obviously the priority since they were the upcoming game. Platinum had all of the major engine improvements and backend optimizations, so in late July, those upgrades were merged into HeartGold SoulSilver. Similar to the soundbank situation, this would result in minor side effects that unintentionally affected the game, such as the return of a Lucas back sprite. But overall, the merge was smooth. And very importantly, from this point forward, HGSS was running on Platinum's improved engine. By the end of August, Ecruteak's final music was now implemented. Finally, when healing at a Pokémon Center, you would no longer turn into Lucas. Can't say the same about the bike. Again, this looks so wrong to see. Look at this NPC. Cianwood Gym featured a strange platform design at the stage, and story events had progressed all the way into Olivine City. Some other notable additions included the legendary dogs in Bell Tower, along with a cutscene. National Park now had its rounded fountain, the Olivine Lighthouse interior was in the game, complete with events, Team Rocket HQ was now in the game, but was still no Rocket Grunt sprites. The Dragon's Den was complete, and Tojo Falls was complete too. The Pokeathlon also received significant polish. In this particular minigame, you tap your Pokemon with a stylus and shoot forwards to move them. At the end of September, Pokemon Platinum officially released. With Platinum finished, Game Freak could now fully shift their development resources to HeartGold and SoulSilver, which meant more staff and very big and frequent changes. Hitting our first milestone of this new dev period, this one brought some big refinements. First up, the UI was updated to look much closer to the final game. Very clean and less cluttered, and far more readable. That said, the run button was still just a button. Cianwood Gym removed the strange platform, but in return the building was now in the cliff. This whole area just looked off, like the terrain scaling didn't fit the buildings. Seems like it gave the devs some trouble for a while. The platform was still technically there too, just invisible. Unfortunately, the wing-like designs on the gyms were now gone. It's a bit of a shame, I really like them. The Burn Tower and Ekritique now featured the updated design, erasing the original layout completely. Routes 47 and 48 continued to be iterated on, but more importantly, the Johto Safari Zone was now in the game. It looked very off though, like the entire map was just a flat 2D plane. I haven't seen this for any other location prototype. And for the first time, we hear a Kanto track in-game, specifically Route 1. This was also a test map placed within the Kanto region. Vermilion City had a clear structure now, complete with music. Meanwhile, outlines for Saffron, Celadon and Cerulean were present, without music. It appears they began building out Kanto from Vermilion City, which makes sense since you arrive there first in the game. I flew over to Pewter City to see if anything had changed, and found an outline of a completely unrecognizable city. Turns out this was an early version of the Pokeathlon Dome. Up until now, the Pokeathlon minigames and a placeholder interior had existed, but the exterior model hadn't. This was my first time seeing it in-game, and it was randomly sitting over Pewter City. Another huge milestone, the Elite Four were finally added. They were comprised of completely random trainer placeholders, and the final boss was you, or technically, Cynthia disguised as you. As we head into the final stretch of 2008, development was clearly setting up for that last push of development in the new year. Debug now starts in Goldenrod City instead of Ekritique, and Lapras is suddenly in your party, allowing you to surf. All of Johto's gym interiors were now in the game. Route 47 and the Safari Zone were now represented on the map. Though for some reason a huge number of NPCs across the game were suddenly replaced with Team Galactic Grunts. This wouldn't change for a while. At least the Team Rocket Grunts were now in the game. Lyra's partner Pokemon became a Teddiursa sprite, and the red Gyarados was temporarily replaced with a Clefairy sprite. At least interacting with it triggered a battle with red Gyarados. The Cianwood Gym debacle had finally been fixed too. They actually had to rearrange the town's design, and I believe this is the only town in the game that underwent a complete layout overhaul. The Cliff Edge Gate connecting Cianwood to Route 47 was added too, which was a brand new location in itself. The battle frontier west of Olivine City was added in. My theory is that it was a remnant of the Platinum merge. And the proper Safari Zone had finally replaced the 2D plane. The brand new Johto Pokédex was now in the game. This Pokédex honestly had so much charm. The UI design here was just incredible, probably the best it's ever been for Pokemon. The entirety of Kanto was now suddenly modeled too, like all of it. Very fast compared to how long it took for all of Johto to get modeled. Now only Vermilion, Saffron and Celadon were textured, but structurally the entire region existed. Here's how the interior of a Kanto gym looked. It's better than what Johto had at first. Look, I'm in the Kanto Safari Zone. Cerulean Cave's entrance wasn't modeled in, but they left a little cutout for it. You actually couldn't access it in the original, so maybe they were still debating about whether or not they'd put it into this game. Surprisingly, nearly all of Kanto's soundtrack was already in the game, except for Cinnabar Island. I guess they must have completed them earlier with the Johto tracks. Cinnabar Island actually didn't have a dedicated track in the original. However, that would change in a few days. when Cinnabar Island received its first draft theme. Melancholic and very airy. By December 10, the track was finalized. This is such a special location in the Kanto lore, so I'm really glad they made a track that suit the mood so well as let you explore more of it. They really didn't have to. Throughout December, the title screen went through a series of gradual revisions. The 17th was the last time we heard the prototype title track. Then on the 18th, the final title screen music was first implemented. On the 19th, the logo didn't take long to appear anymore. And on the 24th, it had been replaced with a work-in-progress HeartGold title screen, now featuring a brand new Ho-Oh model. That was a lot less complex than the Lugia model we saw previously. And the following day, the title screen received a massive overhaul, now closely resembling the final version we know today. Heading into the new year, the game had a very solid base to build off and polish. They already had so much in the game, and were well ahead of schedule compared to every single Pokemon game up to that point. And they were only gonna ramp up as we got closer to release. Hitting our first milestone of the new year, the logo now officially read as Pokémon HeartGold. The bag UI was almost finalized, and the rest of Kanto suddenly turned white. This likely happened because the leftover Diamond and Pearl tile set was now removed, leaving only the HeartGold tiles. Most of January's work focused on populating interiors and dungeons, and getting the small details right. Finally, Lyra's partner was Amaryl. By this point, most of Johto's endgame structure was in. Even though placeholder NPC sprites were still scattered throughout the game, the Elite Four already had their final teams. And perhaps most excitingly, there was finally visible progress on Mount Silver's map. Just a few days later, something called the Sint Ruins was added to the game. Of course a reference to the Sindro ruins. However, the dungeon first appeared on the 19th. And the full map was actually present, no checkerboard placeholder. Then on February 16, Viridian Forest was added. Honestly, this was one of my favorite locations in the game. I love that they went out of their way to make several small design changes when they really could have just copied it one-to-one and called it a day. The next milestone was on Pokemon Day. As you know, in the modern day, this is typically when the upcoming game would be announced. Regarding the state, by now the Pokeathlon Dome was fully integrated into the overworld, officially marking the Johto map as complete. Kanto was essentially complete as well, interiors included. Even Cerulean Cave, one of the last major interiors, was now in the game. But despite placeholder sprites, the overworld itself was functionally complete. It's insane how quickly Game Freak assembled the game once they shifted full focus to it, especially since they probably only had around 100 employees or less. Even the gym interiors across both regions were complete, and looked absolutely incredible. Real works of passion. A few weeks later, the battle UI had undergone significant revisions as they were getting closer to the final game's layout. On the 19th, the earliest revisions of many character portraits were added, and these looked very rough. Super Cool Sonic at TCRF has a full list detailing all of the rough portraits from March 19, and all of the micro revisions as they evolved into their final forms. All of these literally went from these random rough sketches to a finished product through multiple revisions in just a few months, and cut it really close to the end of development. Towards the end of the month, the embedded tower was added, the location that would later house the Hoenn legendaries. This was actually the last dungeon created for the game. And most importantly, the final room of Mount Silver was now in the game. Placeholder Red stood at the top, and interacting with him would crash the game. He was simply too powerful. By now the Pokeathlon minigames were complete, featuring everything in the final game. It really feels like they were prepping for a massive sprite replacement phase all at once. And Cerulean Cave finally had an entrance. The entire cave was in the game too, along with a return of a familiar friend. Overall, there were small refinements all over the map that just gave the game more detail. From around April onwards, there were quite a few milestones back to back, or very close to each other, namely due to things like internal presentations, promotional material, and demo prep, but I'll go ahead and highlight the major developments. On April 14, the final logo appeared, though the title screen still wasn't complete because the top screen was technically still using the prototype Lugia screen. Then 2 days later, for Rainbow Wing and Silver Wing were added to the game. Honestly, I prefer these prototype sprites to the final version, but that's besides the point, because the addition of these items meant that the legendary events could now be accessed in the game, pretty much marking the core story content complete. Especially based on the timeline, I would say the rest of development was mostly geared towards polishing the game, fixing bugs, and adding some last minute events. On the 25th, the intro sequence finally became accessible in-game. Still a work in progress, though it was now working. And keep in mind, this was roughly 2 months before the game's completion. And the title screen was now complete, and the bag UI now featured a prototype bag view. I believe this is the first time there's ever been a 3D trainer model in mainline Pokemon history. For reference, HeartGold and SoulSilver were officially revealed on May 8, 2009, and the following day, the first revision of the Sinjil Ruins event appeared, though attempting to trigger it would crash most of the time. Meanwhile, the embedded tower now had the Hoenn legendaries, and finally, Trainer Red was now in the game, using this as a battle sprite for some reason. At least his team was now in the game. And since you could now defeat Red, this meant you could now trigger the Kanto and Hoenn starter events featuring Oak and Steven respectively. The Pokemon League interior had also been updated, and once again, they went way harder than they needed to. They really didn't have to make this interior look any nicer than it already did, but it's really a reflection of just how much extra time they had to polish the game. All of the Elite Four interiors were in the game too, looking absolutely phenomenal, also featuring the correct sprites. I mentioned a bit on character portraits earlier. Some character portraits like Giovanni's didn't even exist until late May, and much like his Overworld sprite, one of the last major portraits implemented was Giovanni. So by extension, one of the last events created was the Ilex Forest Celebi event, which makes sense, it was a distribution event after all. But the fact they went out of their way to create this elaborate event that added so much extra lore to the Pokemon world for an event most players didn't even get to play is really commendable. That is passion. This was also when Silver's redesigned sprite finally appeared, both in Battle and Overworld. Yes, after so long, and yes, this late. And surprisingly, this was when the run button on the bottom screen finally became a toggle. Heading into June, this was when the intro sequence was complete. They polished up the Professor introduction, kind of funnily just color swapped the firered Oak sprite. He never actually wears that color in the game either. They literally just color swapped the firered Oak sprite, and that was it. Most players didn't even notice. But I can't lie, he looked clean. By this point, all Team Galactic placeholder sprites were gone from the overworld, and Trainer Red was finally implemented for real this time, essentially marking the game complete. From here on out, development shifted towards bug fixing as they entered the final month of development. It's a bit difficult pinpointing exactly when HeartGold completed development, but based on current evidence, all signs point to July 23rd, 2009. After completion, Game Freak took a short break before picking up on Black and White's development later in the year. That said, technically localization work began almost immediately with the introduction of a GS card build on July 29, referencing a card game. In the localization build, the game corner was censored and replaced with Voltorb Flip due to overseas gambling regulations. And lo and behold, in August, MD Travis discovered that there was indeed an unreleased, unlocalized Japanese version of Voltorb Flip. One of the biggest discoveries in the timeline in my opinion. It is just crazy to see this even exist. Here's also an amazing tracking graph from MD Travis, comparing the frequency of HeartGold builds to Black and White. As you can see, HeartGold had a tremendous amount of time and revisions over a much longer period, while Black and White had numerous condensed peaks after the conclusion of HGSS. In a way, it kind of feels like HeartGold was a stepping stone for Game Freak properly learning the DS engine and refining their tools to prepare for their most stunning games at the time in Generation 5. As I mentioned earlier, these games were far ahead of schedule compared to every Pokemon title before them. And even though I'm personally not the biggest Johto fan, I cannot deny that HeartGold and SoulSilver are the undisputed GOAT of classic Pokemon, and pound for pound, they might very well be the greatest Pokemon games ever made. From a development standpoint, it really can't get any better. And maybe more importantly, it felt like these games were made by fans of the original games, for fans of the original games. I really hope Pokemon keeps making remakes, but if there's one thing this timeline proves, it's that evolution works best when it respects its roots. And that, my friends, is the end of a video. If you enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.